Imagine you're driving through your neighborhood. It's a Tuesday night. Maybe you're headed home from the grocery store.
Right, just a completely average evening.
Exactly. And you've got a busted taillight, or, maybe you do a slightly aggressive rolling stop at a four-way intersection.
We've all been there.
Yeah, we have. And suddenly, the red and blue lights flash in your rearview mirror. You sigh, you pull over to the shoulder, and you just wait.
The classic sinking feeling.
Right. You watch the local police officer step out of their cruiser, flashlight in hand, walking up to your window. Now, in your mind, this is a purely administrative moment. It's a $50 ticket. It's, an annoyance. It's just a local cop enforcing a local community rule.
I mean, it is basically the most mundane interaction with state authority that a citizen can possibly have.
It is. But what if I told you that, over the last 25 years or so, that exact profoundly mundane scenario, the local beat cop pulling someone over for a minor traffic violation, has quietly been engineered into the absolute front line of international counterterrorism?
It's honestly a staggering reality to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
Because we are living in this policing landscape today where the boundary between enforcing a municipal traffic code and actively disrupting a global terror cell has been completely fundamentally erased.
Well, and that's exactly what we're going to get into today. Welcome to our deep dive into the source material. I want to jump straight into how we got here, because the analogy that I just cannot get out of my head is this. It's like asking an emergency room doctor to suddenly act as an epidemiologist.
Oh man, that is an excellent way to frame it. Really.
Because think about it, right? The local cop is the ER doctor. Their entire job is to treat the bleeding patient directly in front of them, right now.
Yes, the immediate crisis.
Exactly. The domestic dispute, the stolen car, the broken window, they serve the immediate community. But an intelligence agent, the counterterrorism operative, is the epidemiologist. They don't actually care about the single patient in the ER.
No, they're looking at the bigger picture.
Right. They are trying to track the invisible, silent spread of a virus across an entire population to, stop a plague before it mutates. You can't just tap an ER doctor on the shoulder and say, hey, while you're stitching up that laceration, I need you to swab the whole city and run statistical models on global viral vectors.
Right, because the tools are completely different. The mindset is entirely opposed, and the stakes are they're completely different.
Yeah.
And, for centuries, governments actually understood that. They kept those two professions entirely separate. To truly grasp why this is so difficult today, we really have to look at the baseline of how the world operated before the year 2001.
Okay, let's set that baseline.
So security professionals categorize this historical divide as the difference between low policing and high policing.
Which, I have to say, low policing sounds almost derogatory, but it's actually the bedrock of our civilization.
Yeah.
Let's break down those mechanics for the listener.
It absolutely is the bedrock. So low policing is just everyday law enforcement. Its defining characteristic is visibility.
Like the cop on the beat.
Exactly. Think of the officer walking the beat in a high visibility vest, or the marked patrol car driving slowly through a neighborhood. The entire mechanism relies on deterrence through presence and the application of criminal law.
So it's very reactive. Like a crime happens, someone's house is burglarized, the police show up, they investigate, they make an arrest, and then the person goes to a public trial.
Precisely. Low policing targets microcrimes, individual victimization. And because of this, the operational mindset of the officer is fundamentally oriented towards service. The public are their clients.
They're there to serve and protect.
Right. The goal is to serve and protect the community in a way that is highly transparent and highly accountable. If an officer in a low policing model does something wrong, there's a public complaint, a public hearing, and a visible resolution.
But then you cronk over into the realm of high policing, and the mechanics they invert completely.
Completely invert. High policing is about the survival of the state itself. It focuses on macro crimes. So we're talking terrorism, espionage, state subversion, massive organized crime syndicates that have the power to actually corrupt governments.
So the goal isn't to arrest someone after they blow up a building. I mean, that's too late. The goal is to prevent the pre-crime. You have to stop the event before the fuse is even lit.
Yes, pre-crime. And because you're operating in that realm of pre-crime, your methods cannot be visible. High policing is inherently covert.
Wiretaps, things like that.
Exactly. Wiretaps, embedded informants, deep surveillance, and disruption. If the target knows they're being watched, the entire operation fails. Therefore, The transparency that completely defines low policing is utterly incompatible with high policing.
Which forces this, like, massive psychological shift in how the officer views the public, right?
Mm.
Because if you are doing low policing, the guy walking down the street is a citizen you are protecting. But if you're in a high policing mindset, you have to look at that exact same guy and wonder, is he a courier for a sleeper cell? The public transforms from clients into potential suspects.
And that mindset shift is incredibly dangerous to a democratic society if it goes unchecked, and it requires a completely different organizational structure, too. Low policing thrives on decentralization. A local precinct captain knows exactly what the local neighborhood needs.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But high policing demands rigid, top-down, centralized command because tracking an international threat requires massive, coordinated intelligence funneled to a single point.
So historically, how did different countries manage this split personality? Because from the source material, an American's tolerance for high policing pre-9/11 was vastly different from, say, a European's tolerance.
Completely different. And it was entirely dictated by the historical trauma of each specific nation. We can really trace this by looking at how three distinct European democracies, the UK, France, and Spain, handled terrorism long before the World Trade Center fell. Let's start with the United Kingdom and the intense trauma of the IRA conflicts, the Troubles, in Northern Ireland.
Right, because this wasn't an abstract threat for the British. This was decades of car bombs in London and assassinations. It was very real.
It was daily life. And in the early 1970s, the British government made a massive strategic error. They utilized extreme high policing tactics, specifically something called Operation Demetrius in 1971.
What did that entail?
They executed mass internments. The British Army and police literally swept through Catholic neighborhoods in Northern Ireland and arrested hundreds of people, basically anyone suspected of having ties to the Irish Republican Army, and just threw them in prison without trial.
Wow. They just bypassed the entire transparent judicial system completely.
Bypassed it completely. They gathered intelligence, deemed these individuals a threat to the state, and locked them up, and it was a total catastrophe.
In what way?
Well, the intelligence was often faulty, for one. It led to the arrest of innocent civil rights leaders alongside actual paramilitaries. But more importantly, the psychological impact on the community was devastating. It completely alienated the Catholic population and served as the greatest recruitment tool the IRA ever had.
So it backfired.
Horribly. The violence escalated exponentially following the internments.
So a heavy-handed high policing tactic actually manufactured more terrorists than it neutralized.
Precisely. And that historical burn forged the modern DNA of British policing. The UK developed a profound cultural and legal norm of proportionality. They learned through blood and failure that if the police push too hard, they lose the public. And if they lose the public, they lose the war.
Which creates an environment of intense media and political scrutiny over police actions in the UK.
Exactly. Now, contrast that cultural trauma with France, because the French experience with terrorism in the mid-20th century created an almost opposite reaction in the public consciousness.
Right, the Algerian War.
Yes. The French context is defined by the Algerian War of Independence in the 1950s and 60s. This was an incredibly brutal, asymmetric conflict. The FLN, the Algerian National Liberation Front, utilized urban terrorism, bombings in cafes, assassinations, and not just in Algiers, but on the streets of mainland France.
The violence was existential for the French Republic.
Yeah.
They felt like the state itself was collapsing.
It pushed the country to the absolute brink of civil war. In response, the French state utilized extreme, systemic high policing and military tactics. We are talking about widespread torture, mass detentions, and the complete suspension of civil liberties in targeted areas.
Which is brutal.
It was. And while history judges those actions severely, the enduring psychological legacy within France was a societal consensus that the survival of the state is paramount.
Meaning, the French public, even today, is generally much more willing to give their police forces wide latitude. Like if the police say, we need to kick down these doors and sweep up 50 people in the middle of the night to protect the Republic, the French media and public are, generally speaking, less likely to demand immediate, transparent justification compared to the British.
Exactly. The primacy of state security is just baked into the French political culture. And then you have Spain, which provides this really fascinating middle ground. Spain had to deal with ETA, the Basque separatist group. But Spain's trauma was compounded by the fact that they were transitioning out of a brutal authoritarian dictatorship under Francisco Franco.
Right, because under Franco, the police were the terrorists to a lot of people. They were a tool of pure high policing oppression.
So when Spain transitioned to democracy in the late 1970s, their police forces were incredibly inept at handling ETA within a democratic framework. For a long time, ETA operated with near impunity because the police didn't know how to gather intelligence without reverting to authoritarian brutality.
They didn't have the middle gear.
Right. But over 2 decades, the Spanish police evolved. By the late 1990s, specifically starting around 1998, they effectively broke the back of ETA.
And the mechanism of how they did that is incredible, based on the sources. They didn't just escalate the violence.
No, they actually managed to harmonize low and high policing. They developed sophisticated covert intelligence networks to track the violent actors, that's the high policing. But simultaneously, they used the transparent democratic rule of law, the low policing, to dismantle ETA's political and financial support structures.
So they went after the infrastructure.
Yes, they arrested the financiers, shut down the propaganda newspapers, and legally suffocated the environment that allowed the terrorists to operate, all while strictly adhering to democratic judicial processes.
Okay, but hold on, let me jump in here. Spain took decades to figure out that delicate balance. The UK learned through the disaster of the IRA. France relied on a cultural tolerance for aggressive state power. But all of these countries were dealing with localized nationalist or separatist groups. I mean, the IRA wanted a united Ireland. ETA wanted a Basque state.
Yes, they were territorial. Their goals were geographically bound.
And then September 11, 2001 happens, followed by the Madrid train bombings in 2004 and the London transit bombings in 2005. I mean, the entire game board was flipped upside down.
It was a global paradigm shift. Overnight, terrorism became the central organizing principle for international security. And it wasn't just the sheer scale of the mass casualty events, it was the structural nature of the new enemy.
Let's drill into that structure for you listening, because fighting the IRA is fundamentally different than fighting Al-Qaeda or ISIS.
Historically, nationalist terror groups operated like traditional armies or organized crime families. They were hierarchical pyramids. You had a commander at the top, lieutenants in the middle, and foot soldiers at the bottom.
Right.
The intelligence strategy was pretty simple. Cut off the head of the snake. If you arrested or eliminated the top leadership, the pyramid collapsed because the chain of command was broken.
But post 9/11 global terrorism doesn't work like that at all. It mutated.
It shifted into what security analysts describe as a tumoral network.
Like a cancer.
Precisely. In a tumoral network, there is no strict chain of command. The movement is composed of autonomous, decentralized cells. These cells might, share a radical ideology. They might consume the exact same online propaganda, but they do not take direct orders from a central boss.
So if you manage to assassinate a high-profile figurehead in a cave halfway across the world, it doesn't actually stop a radicalized cell of 4 guys living in an apartment in Leeds or a lone wolf in Ohio from renting a truck and driving it into a crowd.
It doesn't stop them at all. Because the cells are independent, the disease is systemic. And this meant that the old reactive methods of low policing, waiting for a crime to happen and then responding, were suddenly suicidal for a nation-state. Democratic governments realized they had to adopt high policing not just as a defensive intelligence-gathering mechanism, but as an offensive, preemptive tool.
They had to stop the plot before the truck was even rented.
And that required a massive, immediate reorganization of police structures worldwide. But how easily a country adapted to this terrifying new reality depended almost entirely on how their police forces were organized in the first place, whether they were centralized or decentralized.
Right. Let's look at the centralized systems first. Countries like France or Israel, where you basically have a single national police force.
If you're the Minister of the Interior in a centralized system, adapting to the post-9/11 world is relatively straightforward from an administrative standpoint. You have top-down command. You can basically flip a switch in the Capitol and instantly mandate that every single police precinct in the country prioritize counterterrorism intelligence.
It's just a memo.
Yeah. You can shift budgets, rewrite training manuals, and funnel all localized data directly up to a central intelligence hub with practically zero bureaucratic friction.
Interestingly, there is one major exception to this in the centralized democratic world, mentioned in the deep dive sources, and that is Sweden.
Sweden is a fascinating outlier. They have a centralized national police force, but they made a very deliberate, conscious decision to keep their counterterrorism apparatus entirely separate from their general duties police.
So they didn't merge them.
No, they handle terrorism almost exclusively through a specialized security service called SAPU. This Swedish regular police officer on the street is explicitly not tasked with being an intelligence gatherer for national security. They kept the ER doctor and the epidemiologist in completely separate buildings.
That is a very deliberate choice to protect the culture of their regular police. But then we look at the United States and you see the absolute opposite extreme. The U.S. system is hyper-decentralized.
The scale of decentralization in the United States is almost difficult to comprehend for Europeans. The U.S. has over 17,000 distinct, independent state, county, and local law enforcement agencies.
17,000. That is insane. I mean, you have the NYPD with tens of thousands of officers, all the way down to a rural sheriff's department in Wyoming with 4 deputies and a dog.
And trying to implement a unified, covert, preemptive, high policing strategy across 17,000 independent fiefdoms is an administrative nightmare. There is no central switch to flip. The federal government, the FBI, the CIA, they can't just order a local police chief in Texas to change how their officers patrol.
So how did the U.S. government force this massive paradigm shift onto local cops?
Yeah.
Because they absolutely did it. We saw it happen.
They used the most powerful lever they had, money. Following 9/11, the U.S. federal government unleashed a tsunami of Homeland Security funding. Billions of dollars in grants were dangled in front of local departments.
It's always about the money.
Always.
Yeah.
If a local police chief wanted new armored vehicles, advanced surveillance technology, or funding to create a specialized anti-terror unit, the federal government would enthusiastically write the check.
Which fundamentally altered the DNA of local policing in America.
Sure.
Now, the UK faced a somewhat similar problem, right? They aren't as fractured as the U.S., but they aren't fully centralized either.
Right. The UK has 43 distinct police forces. They didn't rely solely on a chaotic grant system, though. The central government mandated that every single one of those 43 forces establish a special branch dedicated specifically to gathering and analyzing counterterrorism intelligence.
Okay, wait, let me stop you right there, because I have to push back on this entire premise. We're watching centralized systems snap into a high policing posture instantly, and we're watching decentralized systems like the U.S. throw billions of dollars to turn every small-town sheriff into James Bond. But did any of this actually make us safer? Or did we just create a massively bloated, paranoid apparatus where local cops are playing spy instead of solving burglaries?
That is the defining debate of modern security. And to answer it fairly, we really have to look at why intelligence agencies were so desperate to get local cops involved in the first place.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because despite all the clumsiness, despite the oil and water nature of mixing low and high policing, general duties patrol officers possess a devastatingly effective advantage over specialized federal agents when it comes to identifying tumoral terror cells.
It comes down to basic math, doesn't it?
It is an overwhelming numbers game. Look at the personnel disparity in the United States. There are over 708,000 sworn local police officers on the streets every single day.
708,000. That's a massive workforce.
Contrast that with the FBI. The FBI has roughly 11,000 special agents in total, and only a fraction of those are actually assigned to counterterrorism squads.
You cannot beat that coverage. 708,000 sets of eyes and ears embedded in every community, driving down every street, interacting with the public 24/7. Which brings us right back to our opening hook. The routine traffic stop.
Yes, the traffic stop is perhaps the single most potent intelligence-gathering mechanism in existence.
Why, though? Why would an international terrorist, someone planning a sophisticated macro crime, get caught by a local cop enforcing a speed limit?
Because of the inherent friction of the physical world, terrorists, no matter how sophisticated their plot, have to exist in reality. They have to travel, they have to move explosive materials, they have to conduct reconnaissance. And when you are planning an extraordinary, catastrophic macro crime, the psychological stress is immense.
That's human.
Exactly. Under that stress, people make incredibly ordinary mistakes.
The historical examples of this from the sources are absolutely chilling. Let's talk about Timothy McVeigh, the man who detonated a truck bomb outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City in 1995, killing 168 people. How was he actually caught? Because it wasn't a massive FBI wiretap.
No, it wasn't. It was a state trooper. An hour and a half after the bombing, McVeigh was driving on Interstate 35. An Oklahoma Highway Patrol trooper pulled him over. And why? Because McVeigh's yellow Mercury Marquis didn't have a license plate. A totally mundane traffic infraction.
That's what.
The trooper noticed a bulge under McVeigh's jacket, discovered a concealed weapon, and arrested him on a routine firearms charge. The biggest domestic terrorist in U.S. history was literally sitting in a local county jail while the entire federal government was out looking for him.
And it isn't just McVeigh. Look at the 9/11 hijackers.
Hmm.
Mohammed Atta, the tactical leader of the attacks, was pulled over and ticketed in Florida for driving without a valid license just months before flying a plane into the World Trade Center.
Yes.
And Ziad Jarrah, who piloted United Flight 93, was pulled over for speeding in Maryland on September 9th, literally 2 days before the attacks.
These interactions highlight a profound reality. Local police are constantly brushing up against high-level threats, often without realizing it in the moment. The key to modern counterterrorism is ensuring that the data from that mundane traffic, stop the name, the associations, the location, is instantly fed into the epidemiological matrix of high policing.
It's about finding the anomaly in the data. And local cops are perfectly positioned to spot anomalies because they have this intimate, localized knowledge of what normal looks like in their specific jurisdiction.
That localized knowledge is irreplaceable. A federal agent parachuting into a city from Washington, D.C. or London doesn't know the baseline of that community. The local cop does. Take Israel as a prime example of operationalizing this.
Okay.
In Israel, local municipal police work in tight coordination with military police to aggressively track what seems like petty crime, specifically the theft of ordinary army equipment.
Why do they care so much about, like, a stolen uniform or a missing box of flares?
Because to a local cop in a normal environment, a stolen uniform is just petty theft, maybe some kids messing around. But to an Israeli police officer who understands the specific threat landscape of their environment, the theft of a military uniform is a glaring, blaring red siren, indicating that a terror cell is preparing for an infiltration attack. They see the signal in the noise because they know the neighborhood.
And this localized advantage extends into how human intelligence is gathered, too. We have to talk about informant networks because this is where the local cop just completely outclasses the specialized federal agent.
Absolutely. The lifeblood of high policing is human intelligence informants. But how do you actually get an informant? You don't just ask nicely. You need leverage.
Walk me through the mechanics of this for the listener. How does a beat cop actually flip someone?
Okay, imagine a local patrol officer catches a 19-year-old kid breaking into a warehouse or selling a mid-level quantity of narcotics. That is a felony arrest. The kid is looking at real prison time. But this local cop has been working this beat for 10 years. He knows the kid's older brother, he knows the kid's mother, he knows the kid isn't a hardened terrorist. He's just a local criminal trying to make a buck.
So the cop sits the kid down in the precinct.
Exactly. The cop says, look, I can ruin your life today, or you can help me out. You operate in the local underworld. You see things. I want to know who is suddenly flush with cash. I want to know who is renting out the back of that abandoned garage down the street. I want to know who is buying weird chemicals.
The cop uses the leverage of a low policing criminal arrest to recruit a high policing intelligence asset.
And it works because the informant is deeply embedded in the community's gray market. A specialized federal agent cannot do this. A clean-cut intelligence operative can't just walk into a local dive bar or a marginalized housing project, sidle up to a drug dealer and say, hello, would you like to inform on your neighbors for the federal government?
Right. They get laughed out of the room, or worse, they have no leverage, no relationship, and they stick out horribly.
And for that exact same reason, local cops make infinitely better undercover operatives. If you need to infiltrate a local gang or a radicalized cell operating out of a specific neighborhood, you don't send in the guy from Quantico. You send in the local vice cop who already has the regional accent, who knows the local sports teams, who knows the geography of the alleyways.
Furthermore, local police already possess established, trusting partnerships with the private sector. The beat cop knows the manager of the local hardware store.
Yeah.
They know the guy who runs the cash-only short-term truck rental agency.
Yeah.
They could just drop in, grab a coffee, and say, hey, let me know if anyone comes in buying 50 bags of fertilizer in cash, or if someone rents a box truck but doesn't seem to have a business to move.
It's an incredible web of tripwires.
Okay, you've built an incredibly compelling case here. On paper, this sounds flawless. The 708,000 local cops are a giant, unblinking net covering the entire country, and the federal agencies are the spear ready to strike when the net catches something.
On paper, yes.
But here is the reality check. If we demand that every patrol cop acts as an intelligence gatherer, aren't we asking them to do a job they simply do not have the time, the training, or the resources for.
You are hitting on the fundamental crisis of modern policing. When you force local police into the high policing arena, you trigger a devastating cascade of negative consequences. We fall into what analysts call the resource trap, which inevitably leads to the profound erosion of community trust.
Let's dissect the resource trap first, because the daily operational pressures on a patrol officer are already staggering without adding counterterrorism to their plate.
They really are. They're responding to domestic violence calls in progress. They're dealing with fatal traffic accidents. They're handling mental health crises on the street.
Time is a zero-sum game. Every single hour an officer spends sitting in an unmarked car conducting covert surveillance on a suspected radical or sitting behind a desk analyzing counterterrorism databases is an hour taken away from traditional, highly visible community service.
And the community feels that absence immediately.
They notice it.
They absolutely do. It means fewer officers available for school liaison programs. It means foot patrols disappear. Most dangerously, it means rapid response times to local 911 calls skyrocket. If a citizen calls the police because someone is breaking into their house, and the police take 35 minutes to arrive because half the shift is assigned to a joint terrorism task force, the social contract breaks down.
Yeah, people start to ask what they're even paying taxes for.
Yeah.
And there's also this massive psychological brain drain that happens internally within the department, driven by what I can only call the sexy career track.
Ah, yes, the allure of counterterrorism.
Let's be brutally honest. If you are an ambitious 25-year-old rookie cop, what sounds better at a dinner party? I spent my week directing traffic around a broken water main and breaking up a bar fight, or I am attached to a federal task force hunting international terror cells.
The prestige factor is undeniable. It causes severe tunnel vision within departments. The absolute best, brightest, and most proactive officers constantly maneuver to get off the street and into the intelligence units. This drains the most capable talent away from crucial, foundational community policing roles.
But the internal bureaucratic mess is almost nothing compared to the external damage.
Yeah.
The far more dangerous consequence is the catastrophic impact on police legitimacy and public perception.
When a local police department shifts its operational DNA from low policing to high policing, the public senses it instantly. Remember that mindset shift we discussed earlier? The public feels the transition from being treated as a client to being treated as a suspect.
And this disproportionately, aggressively impacts minority and marginalized neighborhoods.
The historical data and sociological studies are incredibly explicit on this point. If marginalized communities feel that the state neglects their basic social needs, like failing schools, poor infrastructure, and unchecked local crime, but simultaneously subjects them to heavy-handed, aggressive intelligence gathering and surveillance, their trust in the state evaporates entirely.
I mean, put yourself in the shoes of someone living in one of these neighborhoods. You call the cops because your bicycle was stolen or your car was broken into, and nobody shows up. They don't have the resources.
Right.
But the next day, you see unmarked vans in your neighborhood. You see people being questioned aggressively. Informants are crawling through your community looking for radicals. How long until you stop talking to the police completely?
You stop almost immediately, and that represents a massive, fatal strategic failure for the state. Because, as we established, high policing relies entirely on civilian cooperation. The police need those localized tips to uncover the tumoral terror cells. If the community shuts down out of anger and distrust, the intelligence goes completely dry.
It's worse than just silence, though, isn't it? If a government fails to provide basic social equity and only interacts with a marginalized community through the barrel of a SWAT team or the lens of a surveillance camera, they actively create the environment for radicalization.
That's the darkest part of this.
Marginalized youths, feeling utterly alienated by their own country, are infinitely more likely to turn to radicalized centers or extremist ideologies for the identity and support they're being denied by the state.
To see the razor's edge of how this plays out in reality, we have to look back at the contrasting methodologies of France and the UK, specifically how they navigated this exact issue of public trust in the modern era.
Right, because France, relying on that historical consensus that state security is paramount, leaned into tactics that would cause outright riots in other countries.
Look at Operation Chrysanthemum in France in 1994. The French intelligence services suspected a radical Islamic network was operating in the country. Their approach was not to conduct a surgical, highly targeted strike based on precise intelligence. They essentially kicked in the doors of entire neighborhoods. They aggressively arrested and interrogated 110 people simultaneously.
110 people. They cast an absolutely massive net, knowing full well the vast majority of those people were entirely innocent.
A French official literally referred to it in the press as kicking the anthill just to see what would scurry out.
Unbelievable.
They wanted to disrupt the network through sheer panic and dragnet intelligence gathering. And the fascinating part, because of the French societal conditioning regarding state security we talked about, there was relatively little public or media backlash to sweeping up that many people without hard individualized evidence.
But if you tried kicking the anthill in London, the political fallout would be apocalyptic.
The UK approach is the polar opposite. Acutely aware of public perception, civil liberties, and constantly haunted by the ghost of the IRA internments, the British police are terrified of alienating the Muslim community. Therefore, UK counterterrorism operations rarely target more than 15 people at a time. They demand intense, verified intelligence before moving, driven by a profound fear of intense media backlash and the destruction of community trust.
But even with all that British caution, the inherent friction of deploying high policing tactics in dense, civilian urban environments is incredibly volatile. The margin for error is absolute zero, but humans are fallible.
And that fallibility leads to unspeakable tragedy. The most poignant example from the sources is the shooting of Jean-Charles Menez in London.
This case is just heartbreaking, and it perfectly illustrates the nightmare of merging these two worlds. It's July 2005. London has just suffered catastrophic suicide bombings on its transit system. The entire city is on a knife's edge. The police are on maximum alert, utilizing aggressive, covert, high-policing surveillance to find the remaining terror cells.
In the fog of war, a surveillance team mistakenly identifies Jean-Charles Menezes, a completely innocent 27-year-old Brazilian electrician, heading to work as a suspected suicide bomber.
They track him, they follow him into the Stockwell subway station. And because they are operating under the high policing mandate of preventing a pre-crime, they believe he is literally about to detonate a bomb on a train. The armed tactical officers don't try to arrest him. They board the train and shoot him multiple times in the head.
It was a catastrophic failure of intelligence and execution. It highlights the deadly pressure that occurs when covert, high-stakes counterterrorism tactics are deployed by domestic police in an everyday civilian environment. The mandate to shoot, to kill, to protect the state collided tragically with the life of an innocent commuter.
Which brings me to the ultimate, paralyzing dilemma of this entire deep dive. It feels like an unsolvable paradox. You absolutely need the local community's trust to gather the human intelligence required to stop a terrorist attack. But the very act of gathering that intelligence, the covert surveillance, the informants, the raids, the mistaken identities, systematically destroys the community's trust. Doesn't that paradox completely doom the strategy of using local cops for counterterrorism?
It is the tightrope walk of modern security.
Right.
And it's the exact problem that police managers and security agencies are trying to solve as we move into the present and look toward the future. How do you balance the immediate emergency response of a beat cop with the long-term pre-crime prevention of an intelligence agency?
Is there a middle ground?
The answer lies in the evolution of integrated security and finding a radical middle ground.
And ironically, a real-world example of this successful middle ground comes from London, directly following those same 2005 bombings. They launched something called the Safer Neighborhoods program.
Yes. Following the terror attacks, there was a massive political urge to militarize the police, right? To turn everyone into a spy. But London did something incredibly counterintuitive. They didn't abandon low policing, they doubled down on it. They deployed roughly 4,000 police and community support officers into all 624 specific local wards of the city.
They put the cops back on the beat. They built the strategy on a fascinating premise. Neighborhood security is national security.
The logic was brilliant. They realized you cannot demand intelligence from a community you do not serve. So these officers were tasked with hyperlocal issues. They fixed broken streetlights, they stopped petty vandalism, they dealt with local noise complaints.
Low policing.
Pure low policing. They proved to the community that the state cared about their daily lives.
And the result? By building genuine serving relationships, they built profound trust. And because the trust was there, the intelligence gathering happened organically. The community wanted to talk to the police. A mother would pull an officer aside and say, "Hey, you helped me with that issue last month. I think you should know there are some strange men meeting in the basement next door."
It is a brilliant inversion of the paradox. Service breeds trust, and trust breeds intelligence. On a larger international scale, the European Union has attempted to adopt a similar multidimensional approach to solve the centralized versus decentralized problem.
Because the EU has dozens of sovereign nations, all with different police forces. How do they share intelligence without turning every local German or Spanish cop into a federal spy?
They created Europol's European Counterterrorism Center, or the ECTC. It operates on a hub-and-spoke model. The ECTC acts as a massive centralized intelligence hub. It allows local member states to maintain their distinct community-focused policing identities, the spokes.
Oh, I see.
So a local police force in Munich can remain entirely focused on community service. But if they stumble across an anomaly, they can seamlessly feed that data up to the ECTC hub, which connects the dots across the continent.
Okay, but bringing this down to the street level, for the listener, to the actual human beings running these departments. Imagine a fictional police chief, let's call her Chief Miller, running a mid-sized city department in the US or Europe today. She is staring at this massive dilemma. How does she actually manage this without destroying her department?
To help leaders like Chief Miller navigate this incredibly complex landscape, security researchers have synthesized a critical 10-point framework. It is essentially a survival guide for police managers who are forced to decide exactly how to balance general duties with intelligence specialization.
Let's walk through Chief Miller's decision matrix, because this is where the rubber meets the road.
So the first thing Chief Miller has to do when faced with the pressure to fight terrorism is to critically evaluate the creation of any new organizational units.
Right. She has politicians breathing down her neck saying, we need a joint terrorism task force. But she has to look at her actual local threat landscape and ask, do I really need a dedicated squad of spies in this town, or is this just security theater?
Exactly, which leads directly to the second principle. Before building a new, shiny counterterrorism unit, she must look at enhancing her existing functions. Can she train her regular beat cops and first responders to be better at spotting anomalies, rather than pulling her 5 best detectives off the street to sit in a specialized intelligence room?
Then comes the most corrupting influence, the money. Chief Miller is offered a massive federal grant. She has to carefully assess if that increased funding is explicitly, restrictively tied to counterterrorism.
This is a massive trap. If she takes a $2 million grant that can only be used for high policing surveillance gear, but her department is struggling to afford basic patrol cars or mental health crisis training, she is fundamentally distorting her department's mission to chase federal cash.
And that forces her to monitor the reallocation of internal resources, which is point 4. She has to look at her spreadsheets. If she sees that the budget for community outreach programs is shrinking, while the overtime budget for covert surveillance is exploding, her department is losing its balance.
And it isn't just money, it's manpower. Point 5 is she must watch out for the reorientation of traditional operations. Are her patrol officers still executing low policing? Are her traffic cops still aggressively looking for drunk drivers to keep the roads safe? Or have they been quietly instructed to only pull over vehicles that fit a specific counterterrorism profile?
Which brings up the most explosive issue for civil rights, point 6. Chief Miller has to ruthlessly scrutinize changes in crime intelligence, targeting to ensure minorities aren't being unfairly profiled.
If her intelligence net is only cast over one specific demographic or one specific neighborhood, she is not only violating civil liberties, she is actively destroying the trust we just established is vital. Furthermore, by hyper-focusing on one community, she creates a massive blind spot where other domestic threats can operate unnoticed.
Point 7. She also cannot operate in a vacuum. She has to actively increase interagency planning and coordination. She needs to be talking to the federal agencies, sure, but she also needs to be talking to the police chief in the next county over, and to the private sector business leaders in her town.
And when she talks to the feds about that grant money, point 8 is she has to manage the acquisition of specialized equipment. Does her mid-sized municipal department truly need a $500,000 armored personnel carrier, bomb-sniffing dogs, and military-grade hazmat gear? Or is acquiring that equipment just going to terrify the local populace and make her officers act like an occupying army?
She also has to play lawyer for point 9. She has to constantly review changes in legal authorizations regarding human rights. If the federal government says, hey, we relaxed the rules on wiretapping, she has to ensure that her local officers utilizing those new rules aren't violating state constitutional protections or local civil rights ordinances.
And finally, point 10, Chief Miller has to look after the humans under her command. She has to track the unplanned expenses, specifically things like massive overtime budgets, and the acute psychological stress management for her officers. High policing is a dark, paranoid, high-stakes world. It burns people out. If she is pushing her regular cops into that world, she has to account for the devastating human cost on her force.
Walking through that matrix, it feels like a monumental, almost impossible task. Chief Miller has to be a politician, a lawyer, a social worker, a tactical commander, and an accountant all at once. Can any human being actually manage a local police force under these conditions without fundamentally losing the soul of the department?
It requires exceptional visionary leadership. It requires a police chief who fundamentally understands that the primary sacred mission of the police is to serve the public. Counterterrorism must be viewed as a component of that service, not a replacement for it. The moment a department decides that fighting terror is more important than serving the community, they have already lost the war.
So let's take a step back and summarize the incredible journey we've taken today. We started by looking at the stark historical divide between the ER doctor and the epidemiologist, the distinct lanes of transparent low policing and covert high policing. We saw how the trauma of the IRA, the Algerian War, and ETA shaped different national tolerances for state power.
We examined the terrifying paradigm shift triggered by 9/11 and the rise of decentralized tumoral terror networks, forcing the world to blur those lines violently. We watched decentralized systems like the U.S. throw billions of dollars at the problem, while centralized systems adapted rapidly.
We analyzed the undeniable mathematical advantage that local patrol cops bring to the fight: their massive numbers, their intimate local knowledge, and their unique ability to leverage everyday crime into informant networks. We saw how a routine traffic stop for a missing license plate can take down a mass murderer.
But we fiercely weighed those advantages against the devastating costs. The zero-sum drain on community resources, the allure of the sexy career track, the erosion of civil liberties, and the catastrophic loss of public trust, highlighted by tragedies like the shooting of Jean-Charles de Menezes, when a community feels it is being occupied rather than protected.
Ultimately, the evidence points to a profound realization. The success of modern counterterrorism doesn't rely on turning every beat cop into a covert federal spy. It relies on excelling at traditional, boring, everyday community policing. It is about building the bedrock of trust, fixing the streetlights, so that the vital intelligence surfaces naturally from a community that wants to be protected.
And as we conclude, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, drawing on the 2030 foresight projections regarding the future of urban security. We have spent this entire deep dive talking about the friction of asking a human police officer to balance serving and spying. But we are rapidly moving into an era of smart cities. We are talking about predictive big data, interconnected digital infrastructure, ubiquitous facial recognition, and advanced cyber surveillance layered over every inch of the urban environment.
So what happens when the algorithms of high policing become fully, invisibly automated into the low policing infrastructure of your local neighborhood?
Exactly. Imagine that traffic stop again. When the automated traffic camera flashes to check your speed at that intersection, it isn't just issuing a $50 ticket. It is simultaneously, instantly cross-referencing your license plate, your facial biometrics, and your cell phone's metadata against global counterterrorism databases in a fraction of a second.
The human cop doesn't even have to make a choice between serving and spying anymore. The technology merges the two seamlessly.
And what does that mean for your privacy and for the future of democratic society? When every routine, mundane interaction with municipal infrastructure is automatically a covert counterterrorism audit, the local neighborhood watch hasn't just become an intelligence agency. The neighborhood itself has become the surveillance state.
It fundamentally changes the relationship between the citizen and the state. It makes you think very differently about that red light camera on the corner or the flashing lights in your rearview mirror for a busted taillight, doesn't it?
It certainly does. The lines between low and high policing won't just be blurred, they will cease to exist entirely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember to keep questioning the world around you. Look closer at the systems operating in your own neighborhood, and we will catch you on the next one.